It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome, Quiller Nation, to another exciting episode of your favorite Shakespeare authorship podcast. I have with me for this episode a special guest who is a novelist and a playwright. His novel is called The Shakespeare Conspiracy, and he also has converted it into a stage play, and it explores the idea that Christopher Marlowe is the true author behind the works of Shakespeare. His name is Ted Bassino. Ted, welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger.
Thank you, Stephen. It's very good to be here.
One of the first things that I wanted to ask you about is, how did you first discover the Shakespeare authorship mystery, and what led you to your belief system that it's Christopher Marlowe is the true writer behind the works with the Shakespeare name on them?
Well, Stephen, I hope you're sitting, because this is going to be a bit of a surprise. But in 1953, and I know people your age, that sounds like, the million years ago. I read an article in, I believe it was Vanity magazine, in which Dr. Calvin Hoffman wrote about his theory that the real author of the Shakespearean works was Christopher Marlowe, and I was fascinated by it. And so from 1953 until 2010, I kind of played with the idea, but it wasn't until one retires and has the time that I thought, well, I'll try a chapter or two. I was living in Venice, Italy at the time, and I had run out of books in English, and I don't read Italian very well. So I thought, well, rather than read, let me try writing. So I wrote a chapter or two. The more I wrote, the more fascinating the subject became. And there are many, many books. I'm sure there's dozens published each year on the Shakespeare authorship question. And many of them, of course, deal with Christopher Marlowe. And so there was more material than I could ever have expected. I really got caught up in it. Finally, in 2010, I published the novel.
It's a very fascinating novel, and it is full of intrigue. And it's one of the things that I've been saying for a while about this mystery is that there are plenty, as you say, there are plenty of scholarly books out there that talk about the different evidence for the different authorship candidates, and plenty out there now that are starting to consider sort of a group tank type of theory as to the authorship behind the Shakespeare name. But one of the things that I love about your book, and it's interesting because I learned of it because I was specifically looking for books like yours, which is sort of this historical fiction mix of the facts of the time, and then of course this obviously the fictional part of it is we have no idea about the dialogue that went on between these characters in history. And you do this wonderful thing where you bring these characters to life and you have their interaction. And I think that that's a much easier way for people who are new to this subject to really absorb the ideas behind the subject, is to follow a storyline and to really come to know some of these characters through the writing. And that's one of the things I really appreciated about the book.
I'm very glad to hear that, because there are so many of, as you say, the nonfiction books that would really be very, very difficult for the average person to simply pick up and read. One has to already have been introduced to the authorship question. But by having it as a novel, I was hoping that it would make it a little more exciting as well as a little more introductory, so that all of a sudden, oh, I see, we're talking about, and it seemed to fit. And I'm glad that you happened to notice that. Yes. That was one of the aims of the book.
Well, the interactions that you include, of course, involve a lot of the major characters that those of us who are familiar with the topic have come across again and again. But you also include some characters that we've maybe heard or that we've seen sort of tangentially connected to the authorship mystery, but you make them more prominent in your version of the story, most specifically the Walsinghams and Thomas Walsingham, even more so than his more popularly known brother, Francis Walsingham. And I think that that's a really interesting angle that we find in the book. And you're not to, spoiler alert, you follow the premise that Marlowe, who I believe you're accurate about, was if not homosexual, definitely bisexual. And I think that that's one of the things that made him an asset to the spy network that I believe he was obviously involved in. And it's interesting because, these Puritans like Francis Walsingham, who were against that type of what they would have called aberrant or irreligious behavior, but when it suited them and they used it to their advantage, they sure did enjoy that as an aspect of him, didn't they?
Yes. And there's one other small hook about the fact about Thomas Walsingham. Some of the nonfiction books on authorship will say that there was a gay relationship between Thomas Walsingham and Marlowe, and some say it was just a strong friendship, and that Walsingham was his sponsor. But the ones that say it was really a gay relationship with two of them brings to light one small factor, and that is if one looks at the life of William Shakespeare, the actor who came from Stratford, he was very, very definitely not gay. I mean, he sired a son out of wedlock, and he did a lot of wandering around London to the houses of ill repute. But if one looks at the life of Christopher Marlowe, not only if you look at the story of Edward II, but also all of his works have a very homosexual flavor to them. And so that would explain how you have an author, people really believe it's Shakespeare, the man from Stratford. How do you have an author that's strictly not gay writing poems and plays that have a strong gay influence? And the answer is because he didn't write them. The man from Stratford did not write them. Christopher Marlowe wrote them. Of course, there's always the question of Marlowe's supposedly died the year before Shakespeare flourished in London.
Well, my history with the Shakespeare authorship mystery actually begins with Marlowe. My first introduction to it was from the father of a school friend who happened to share with me the idea that the man from Stratford was not the true author, and his belief that Marlowe was the author. And he led me to read a book called, I believe the title was The Murder of the Man Who Was Shakespeare. And the theory, of course, being
that's by Christopher Hoffman.
Yes. And of course, the theory there being is that Marlowe's death was staged and that then he went underground and became the famous writer William Shakespeare. And the dates and times do coincide quite well, don't they?
Yes, very definitely. Marlowe was the number one playwright in London up until about 1593. And then he's killed, or supposedly killed. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this itinerant, really, from Stratford on Avon, suddenly bursts onto the scene with these great works, and he had never written anything before. And so people wonder, well, wait a minute, how is that the absolute coincidence? And it's true. It just doesn't make sense, except that it was really Marlowe writing the works.
Well, and there is that reference, and I can't recall immediately right now off the top of my head exactly what play it comes from, but there is a reference in Shakespeare where a character talks about a great reckoning in a small room. And many people believe that that is a reference to Marlowe's staged death.
Yes. And that line is one of many that are clues to the fact that it really was Marlowe. There also are close to, if one looks at the works of Shakespeare that are attributed to Shakespeare, and those that were written by Marlowe, you find that there are close to 100 either similarities or exact duplicates, not just in the line, but also in complete verses of poetry. But one does not find similarities between the works that are attributed to Shakespeare and any other author at the time, any other Elizabethan author. And so one wonders what the coincidences of just all the facts about Christopher Marlowe and the facts about the works attributed to Shakespeare. There are just so many. I mean, it's staggering. But because they think that Marlowe died before Shakespeare flourished or became popular in London, they assume that Marlowe could not be the author, and so you have all these other all the other people like De Vere and Francis Bacon and all of that they say, well, maybe they wrote it instead. They start with the premise that it could not have been the actor from Stratford, and then they try to find an answer. The answer is really there if one examines the Marlowe situation.
Well, and you point out very clearly through the novel that the very important coincidence that Marlowe's supposed death occurs just days before he is about to appear before the Privy Council on charges of treason. And it does seem to me that based on what we know of him and the work that we know he was doing for Walsingham's spy network, including crossing over the channel back and forth into France quite regularly.
Yes.
And more than likely using his proclivity for men to work his way into the bedrooms of prominent men to learn of the doings and the actions and handlings of what was going on in France and maybe even other countries on the continent at the time. It would seem to me that if you're Walsingham, the last thing you want is your homosexual spy to be called before the Privy Council on charges of treason, where he may claim and use his connection to Walsingham in order to escape those charges. And so either he was executed to avoid him appearing and giving his testimony, or they gave him a convenient way out, an escape, by staging his death and putting him into hiding and seclusion somewhere.
And I think the latter definitely is what happened. Yes. And because one looks at the writings that were attributed to Shakespeare, and so many of them take place in Italy. And they started about the time Marlowe dies. I mean, they start being written. And they're written in Venice, and then in Venice, and then they're written in Verona, which is just, I mean, when I lived there, going back and forth in Venice and Verona was, 20 minutes. And then they were Romeo and Juliet, and then you could just follow the plays taking place all the way down the line, including Rome, until they eventually get to Sicily. And that's the last one we get. So Marlowe, one of the characters in the Constable Maunder, says, look, if you just follow the way the way the plays are written, you can see it's almost a map of exactly where Christopher Marlowe was hiding in Italy. And he wrote no plays. There are no plays attributed to Shakespeare that take place in France, and none that take place in what was present day England for them. In other words, there were historical plays about England, but there were none that took place in England. And so one wonders, why Italy? why would that author, the greatest playwright of all times, write so many plays about Italy? He was there. That's why he was writing.
Well, and
of course, there are many
closest
instances.
The closest reference we have you have two plays you could say technically have scenes in France. There's, As You Like It, which takes place in the forest of Ardennes. And then you have the scenes from Henry V, obviously. But you're right. Other than that, there is not really a decision to set any of the stories in France. And then the only English play that isn't a history play is The Merry Wives of Windsor, which is set in Windsor and could be argued as a contemporary time period of the Elizabethan age, right? So I get what you're saying, and there are 13 of them set in Italy, and that's almost, that's more than a third of the canon, right there.
Yes.
And if you eliminate the history plays, then it's more than half of the remaining canon.
Yes. Yes. If you eliminate the history plays, you say, well, where was this author writing about? He was writing about Italy. And these facts just do not seem to be, they don't seem to impress the other people looking for the authorship question. And I mean, I realize that the Stratford, the city, has got festivals, and that's what they're known for, and that's, their economy is hinged on it, and also their pride. And I don't blame them for either one. Of course, if I were from Stratford, that's exactly what I would want. But there's the people that defend the actor Shakespeare, just they really don't have a leg to stand on. But they're very, very cautious and very careful that they protect the name William Shakespeare from Stratford. And I don't blame them. But it does keep the world on its toes, because the questions go back and forth. I don't know if you've seen the latest, but they have the writings attributed to some woman, and every day one finds a different supposed author.
Well, and it is interesting, and I always like to point this out, because like no other author in the history of writing, one of the things that Stratfordians like to point out is, there are 50 different candidates for Shakespeare. They're always coming up with a new candidate every day. And they even include Queen Elizabeth herself as a potential candidate for having written the plays of Shakespeare. And I always like to turn that around and say, well, yeah, what does that tell you? Because no other writer in history has there been more conjecture about that probably did not write the works attributed to him. And yes, up to 50 different candidates, because that just goes to show you that there's a great number of people in the world, and have been for centuries, who don't believe that this country bumpkin from Stratford could have possibly placed quill to ink and created these master works. It's just not believable. It's not conceivable. It's inconceivable.
Stephen, that is the major point. As you just mentioned, without giving an example of Sir Francis Bacon, no one says that the works of Sir Francis Bacon were written by anybody else, or or Michael Kidd, or any of those authors in that period. I mean, they don't question any of them. But as you say, there are hundreds and hundreds of books that come out that question that Shakespeare, the man from Stratford, really didn't write it. Yes, that's a point I'd never considered before. But you've got it. He's the only one they question, and it's obviously why they question it.
Yeah, I always like to bring up Mark Twain, because, of course, Mark Twain was a famous authorship skeptic. And he was one who I believe thought that it was Bacon who wrote the works. He made that very famous quote about it being, one of the noblemen, one of the earls of England. But, to use him as an example, Mark Twain, of course, being a pseudonym, but we all know that Samuel Clemens was behind the pseudonym Mark Twain. And throughout history, no one has ever conjectured that there was some other writer besides Samuel Clemens using the name of Mark Twain. And, he, of course, one of his final works that he ever wrote was Is Shakespeare Dead?, where he theorized about this crazy myth that he believed had been sort of thrust upon the people. The greatness of Shakespeare was thrust upon us, as it were, to paraphrase Malvolio. But yeah, so I think that you're onto something there. But one of the things that I really thought was very interesting about the book is that you go a place where a lot of people don't go, which is to establish a working relationship between Marlowe and Stratford Will. That Stratford Will is the front man and knows he's a front man and is benefiting from the works that Marlowe is feeding to him. And there's one particular scene in the book that I found very humorous, and it's when Will is confronting Marlowe about the sonnets. And he says that he had been having a pint of ale at a local tavern when people started shouting out to him about who is your secret boy lover, who is your fair youth, who is your beloved that you write all these sugar sonnets about. And Will confronts Marlowe and says, "You wrote these to another man. Why did you do that to me? Even my wife has written to me and she has suspicions." And I just cracked up at that moment. It's such a lighthearted, very funny, almost sitcom-esque style of moment. It's a very Shakespearean moment in fact.
And there have been many other questions about if the actor from Stratford, and this may be a bit of a hyperbole, but if the actor from Stratford really could read and write, I mean, so I kind of pushed it in the book. I pushed it to the extreme, but I mean, it was a novel, and so I make no apologies for that to push it to the extreme. But to be honest, that was one of the things that made writing the book fun, is to show the extreme. What if the actor from Stratford really was illiterate, and really, and there are so many stories about that particular actor, including the illegitimate children, including the trips back and forth to Stratford when he would stop at Madame Devenant's tavern and stuff. It is fascinating, and boy, I wish I were still working on it in a way, because some of the stuff that comes out now and then is good. Just, you happen to mention the phrase "sugar sonnets." That really was how they were referred to at the time. They were called the sugar. I mean, some of that stuff I don't want to say I didn't make up. I didn't have to make up. Yeah, they were already talking about it, and you can see how this would affect a heterosexual in a bar in London in those days. They would make fun of him. Yes.
Well, it made for a very humorous exchange and interaction, and like I mentioned, I think that opening people up to this idea that the man from Stratford is not the true author of the plays is easier to do through a piece of fiction, is easier to do through a storyline that makes people intrigued while also entertaining them. And if anyone understood better than anyone in the history of the world that the ability to use dramatization based in history, but that has now sort of been embellished or altered in such a way as to tell a better story, then that is the most effective means to shift the conscience of an audience. And in Shakespeare's case, especially with the history plays, to shift the conscience of an entire nation into a nationalistic view that was pro-England, that was pro-Tudor, and wanted to stand strong in the face of outward threat, and a lot of outward threat. France, Spain, the Pope himself calling for the execution of Queen Elizabeth as the heretical queen, and promising absolution to anyone who committed murder by killing her. I mean, that's a pretty extreme threat in the world. And Shakespeare, the works of Shakespeare suddenly become her, PR campaign, the greatest PR campaign perhaps in the history of the world, during what becomes one of the longest reigns in the history of the world of any monarch too. So it's a really incredible use of drama, and you sort of steal, pardon the pun, but steal a page off of Shakespeare's book with your novel.
And he was, whoever was writing the works of Shakespeare really was able to do exactly what you're talking about. The story of Macbeth is there. I mean, it's in history, but by the time it's written in the play that we now know as Macbeth, it has such drama and such, it's not just trying to wash the blood off the hands and is this the knife that I see before me, but he not only, the writer of the Shakespearean works not only makes them fascinating and makes them interesting, but he takes a little morsel from history, and all of a sudden you've got a play that's a masterpiece. Yeah, he was able to do that. He was able to do that beautifully. And no one criticized him at the time for changing a little bit of history. They didn't. People were not going to the theater in those days to get educated. They were going to the theater to be entertained.
Well, and there's such a thing as, I think he sort of invented dramatic license in that sense. And look at how it has changed the historical view of real life people from history, but that he painted with his brush in the way that he felt was the most dramatic, or that was used to send the message or tell the story he wanted to tell. And it has stuck with us throughout the centuries. I mean, were Antony and Cleopatra truly the great lovers that we through now history have come to know them as? It's really difficult to argue, especially since previous to Antony, she had tied her horse to Herod of Judea before Caesar of Rome, and then Antony. So, this woman bounced around between powerful men throughout her existence.
Oh, yes.
So I don't know how much she was really head over heels in love with Mark Antony, but when we see the play, we read the play, we go, oh, this is, Napoleon and Josephine, right?
Yes. It's amazing. He was able to do that. He would hunt and peck and pick what he wanted, and by the time he would write them, but whoever wrote them, and I keep saying he because I assume it's a man, but I don't know, but by the time he wrote them, they were fascinating, they were interesting, and you only saw the side of the story he wanted. Merchant of Venice. He was doing it. It was very anti-Semitic at the time, which was accepted in those days. But you saw just the perspective that the author wanted you to see. Whoever wrote them, I have great respect for whoever wrote them, and if someday historically we're able to determine that it was Sir Francis Bacon or De Vere or anybody else, I would still admire the works. I mean, they're still fantastic. Although I don't see how could it be anyone but Marlowe.
Well, and you play with some of that in the book where you have moments like, again, there's another moment between Marlowe and Stratford Will, and they are talking about Macbeth. And Marlowe is asking him, well, he says, well, the king, and he's referring to James now because Elizabeth is dead now by this point in the story. And he's referring to James. He says, oh, James really enjoyed the play. And, I knew he was going to like it because I set it in Scotland, and he is a descendant of the great nobility of Scotland. And so I knew he was going to enjoy the play. And he mentions Duncan and he mentions Banquo, I think. And here's Stratford Will staring at him blank-faced. And Marlowe at one point says to him, well, you did read it, didn't you? And he's like, some of it. And there was another funny moment where I laughed out loud while I was reading. I was like, you really do a great job of sort of painting this bumpkin as a bumpkin. And Marlowe, of course, who we know from the works that do have his name on them, was a very skilled writer and obviously
yes.
very well educated, and definitely had the means and the ability to, put phrase to paper and really tell a magnificent story. And, also, you want to talk about the anti-Semitism aspect. You have The Jew of Malta, which is one of Marlowe's great plays.
Yes.
And then, when you talk about his sort of sacrilegious behavior, I mean, when you read Faust, his Dr. Faustus, it's, that's just all, it's painted all up and down with his disregard for religion and his lack of reverence for God and Christ. And he's so clever in the way that he paints that and is allowed to do things that most writers would have never gotten away with by using it as an anti-papacy story. And so everyone is against the Pope because they know the Pope has called for the death of their queen. And so now Marlowe gets to sneak in all of these attacks on religion in the name of it being an attack on the Catholic Church. And it's very, very clever, very smart writing.
And by comparison, the man from Stratford was born a Catholic and did die a Catholic. I mean, there is such a difference between that and those little phrases that they attribute to Marlowe about religion that I'm not sure you want to put in your conversation here. But Marlowe was very critical of religion, organized religion. I don't know how he felt about it, but he was very critical of organized religion. And you had Shakespeare, who probably was a little more religious than the average person. I mean, he could have been, that actor could have been hounded in England for being Catholic, but that went by the wayside. Yes. It's clever. The comparison of the two people, whoever wrote it and Marlowe, are just, or not whoever wrote it, but of the man from Stratford and Marlowe, the comparisons are staggering. Opposite sides of the street.
Definitely. And you do include some of the aspects of Marlowe's sacrilege in the book, because it is a true part of who he was and his history. And it's one of the reasons why he was going to be called before the Privy Council was, some of the accusations made against him.
Yes, and that was the reason he was put up for treason. It's because of those the papers they found that were anti-religious. Yes.
Well, he went pretty far. I mean, he was definitely an atheist, I would say. And he went pretty far, even so far as to accuse Christ of being homosexual and having a homosexual relationship with John the Beloved.
Yes, very much so. And he made fun of his mother. He made fun of Jesus' mother. And he was not only atheistic or agnostic, whatever way one wants to word it, but he was also anti-religion, organized religion. Yeah, not a case of he didn't want it. He also was against it. He could see so many, especially in that period, so many of the things that the church was doing wrong, from selling indulgences to.
Well, and one could argue that in the Shakespearean canon, you see, I've seen it argued both ways, where I've seen people argue and say, well, the author who wrote the Shakespeare canon was a Catholic sympathist and someone who was obviously enamored with all things Italianate, and of course, Italy being one of the most, if not the most prominent Catholic country in the world at that time. And, but then I've also seen it argued the other way, where people will point to and say, well, yeah, but look at how he paints the clergy in the plays. Friar Lawrence in Romeo and Juliet is this meddler who ends up resulting in the deaths of these young people. Isabella in Measure for Measure is a nun, but it gets played against her in such a way as to demonstrate that in the end, she's maybe willing to doff her habit and give up her vows in order to connect with the Duke and rise to power. So there's, there are plenty of instances where you could say that it's necessarily not Catholic sympathist, but it's more condemning. I will say he is, I think, far more barbed in his writing when he is writing characters that are of the cloth but not Catholic. I mean, his lampooning of other ministers and doctors of the church, as it were, is very comical and clown-like, especially, for instance, Merry Wives of Windsor. You have the Huguenot preacher in that play who is for all intents and purposes a big caricature of a man type of a role. So it's a very interesting thing then to say, well, if it is Marlowe, he's been consistent. He was consistent through his life as being a challenger of the church and religious doctrine. And then if he is the true writer of Shakespeare, continued to do so throughout the canon as he wrote the plays.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating to follow any of those trains of thought that might have gone through the writer's mind to see how they reflected in the plays and reflected in his life. But until we know who it actually was and a few more details of his life, if it be Marlowe or anybody else, they're just mysteries to go challenging us. Yeah, we keep following the trails. Yeah.
One of the really important things about your book as well, so not only is it, this fun story where we meet these characters and we see your versions of their potential interactions and how you elaborate on the relationships that they have with each other. And before I get to this point, but quickly to references we've been talking about, we see from your perspective Marlowe's creation process. There are a couple of different times in the book where he's working on one of the plays and he's struggling with how he wants to, paint this character or that character. One specific moment I remember is you have him sitting at his writing table and he has Holinshed's Chronicles in front of him and he's trying to figure out exactly what words he wants to put in the mouth of Marcus Brutus during the assassination of Caesar, for instance. And again, we see this process of a writer who's taking dramatic license in order to tell the story and paint the characters the way he wants them to be painted in order to deliver the message he's looking for. That's one of my favorite references that you can make is, Plutarch says that Caesar was stabbed 23 times, but Shakespeare decides it's going to be 33 times because he loves the number 3 and it's much more impactful. And then when Mark Antony's delivering his speech and he refers to Caesar's 3 and 30 wounds, it's, it's got that, alliteration going for it. And, it's those types of things, right, that a writer does. What I was driving at is you include something that most historical fiction novelists don't do. And what you do often find instead in like scholarly works, is citations in the back. Well, you don't do citations. It's not an annotated novel. But you do include this list of facts from each of the chapters that you've included in each chapter to give the reader a full grasp of how much of the historical truth is in the novel. And then you're also very honest about moments where you have taken dramatic license and where you have placed fictions, and you include those as well. And you say very clearly, here's why I did that. And I found that to be very refreshing how candid and honest that is in the back of the book.
The one that sticks out in my mind, thank you for saying that, and that's what was my intent. But the one that sticks out in my mind is the story at the end, the plot at the end, hinges on Sir Francis Walsingham. And quite honestly, that is entirely made up. Walsingham Sir Francis was dead at that time, but he wasn't dead. He knew Marlowe, and Marlowe had worked for him. But the story part at the end is I had to really fudge the date, but I wanted to make sure everyone knew, and I put it in the preface as well as in the supplement, that this was changed. And why it was changed? It was changed to give it a story, to give it a kick at the end. You always have to have that, the closing lines of the movie.
Well, and it's funny you would say that because,
by the way, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that this is one of the things that helped it when it was the stage version, when it was off Broadway or in some of the other cities that it played in. It's nice to be historical. Got to have kick. It had to have a kick at the end. Had to have a reason for being a play. Yeah.
Well, that's where I was going to lead is because you made that comment just now about you need to have that good line at the end of the movie, and that was a great segue into reminding the listeners that the novel has also been converted into a stage play, and that's the next topic I wanted to talk to you about. Was that always the intent when you were writing the novel? Did you say, I'm seeing this unfold in my mind's eye as I'm telling this story, and I would love to see it enacted upon the stage? Or did that sort of come later? Or, how did that derive? And what kind of differences did you have to make between the novel, which obviously can travel all over the world in our imaginations, but as I know from, my whole life has been producing and directing plays, locations are difficult to create in the minds of an audience, especially if you have so many. One of the things about Antony and Cleopatra that makes it such a nightmare of a play to produce is there's 12 different locations in that play, and it's really hard to demonstrate that for an audience and keep them following along as to where the heck you are in the world.
The making of it in a play is really a bit of a story in itself. I wrote it as a novel, never considering it as a play, even though I had directed for about 50 years in different theaters and colleges and places like that. But after I had finished writing it, I'm from a town I was born and raised in a city called Rockford, Illinois, outside of Chicago, and I got a letter from the head of the theater department at Rockford University, and he said, "You should make this into a play." Well, I'd already written it as a novel, and I'd made it into a movie that was optioned twice. But the man that had pledged $7.5 million to make it into a movie suddenly died. He was Hermano Baroni's, who was the man. He was from Canada. And so that ended. And so I said to Rufus Cadigan, who was the head of the theater department at Rockford University, I said, "I'm tired. I just don't want to make it into a play. It's more work." And he said, "Well, how about if I help you, if we co-write it?" And so we actually co-wrote the play together. And it's the only time I've ever written something with someone. I'm not sure I could do that again, except that we already had the framework. I mean, the book was already written. And so it was mainly trying to think, what can we do to give it fewer locations? What can we do to help the ear as well as the viewpoint? One of the things we had to cut out was the fact that Christopher Marlowe is usually referred to as Kit. We had to be very careful because Marlowe had been living with Thomas Kit, and your ear hears one, and you get confused. But we wrote it, and we wrote it together, and we've rewritten it about 3 or 4 times, primarily for different theaters. Not because the theater was different, we just were in stages of rewrite. And it's gone over big. It was produced last year. It was the most recent in Oklahoma City. And I've seen all of the productions except for the one in Oklahoma City. And I didn't direct any of them. And when I was a director, one of the rules I had was there's only one director. I don't want to hear any suggestions from actors or your friends or your mother. And so I was made it a point not to butt in. I think you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, yes.
And so I did absolutely nothing. I went to see it, not knowing what it's going to look like, and afterwards decided not to discuss it. I mean, it's not that. In one production, they did ask Rufus and me, the other co-author of the play, to give these little like seminars before the play to give you a little more background about the subject, and so we did that. But I mean, we never discussed the play itself with anybody. It's their production, and each production is so different. You couldn't believe it. I mean, well, as you know, every time a play is redone, and I don't care if it's on Broadway or anywhere else, it's always different. And that has been good, though. I have enjoyed seeing them. I wish I could have seen the one in Oklahoma City. I heard that the gentleman playing Marlowe was very good.
Well, I can definitely relate to the concept that there needs to be one director. You know, I always tell my actors that the theater is a benevolent dictatorship. It is not a republic. It is not a democracy. At its best, it's a benevolent dictatorship. And I've actually had to say to more than one actor throughout my career as a director, I'm known for this, and I know actors that have worked with me over the years repeatedly. They can see it coming when it's about to come, because they'll watch their castmate decide that it's their place now to start telling me how to direct the show or making their suggestions in front of the group or whatever type of a thing, and they always know exactly what I'm going to say. And my go-to is I turn to them and say, and when you're directing your version of the play, you can do it that way, but this is my version of the play and we're going to do it my way. So it's a very common thing, I know, and I try to caution them all. I learned this phrase a long time ago, and there's nothing worse than a green room lawyer. And I tell my actors, do not become a green room lawyer. Nobody likes a green room lawyer. And occasionally I'll get an actor who says, well, what does that mean, green room lawyer? So stop giving advice in the green room. Lawyers give advice. Do not use the green room as your place to give advice to other actors. Nobody wants to hear your advice for how you know what you should do in this scene, or you know how you should deliver that line. No, nobody wants a green room lawyer.
You know, as you have that phrase, I had one that became synonymous with my name, and that was the term bootleg director. We don't need any bootleg directors here. I mean, and I'm sure you know this as well as I. You explain this at the very beginning, and so they really are conditioned. But then you have to ride it like a wild horse and make sure that it's not, the bootleg direction doesn't come in, because every actor gets these hints from his mother or his girlfriend, and that gee, it would be better there if you and as you say, there can only be one director, only one. Yeah. You can do it your way when you direct.
Yeah, it doesn't happen as often anymore, and mainly because I work with basically sort of a resident company structure now. So 90% of the actors I work with have worked with me before, and I like to work under those conditions because you get shorthand. You understand why so many film directors like to use the same actors over and over again, because the process streamlines.
That's right. It is true. You have you sometimes you don't have code words. You simply have the look. The eyebrows are raised, and the actor knows. Oh, I see. I'm overdoing it. Yes.
Yeah, you're right. It shortens the number of words necessary. There are certain things you don't have to tell them anymore because they know it. Sometimes at notes after a rehearsal, an actor will give themselves the note, they'll say, I know it. I'll be saying, oh, hey, so-and-so in this scene. And they're going to, and oftentimes my actress will go, yes, I know. I won't do it again before I even say anything, or yes, I know that was a terrible choice. I'm nixing that. I'm going to give you something else tomorrow night. It's those moments that makes everybody laugh because it's like, okay, you read my mind. Well, yes, I read your mind because I've worked with you before and I know exactly what you're about to say. I knew it the moment I did it, that it wasn't a good choice and I was going to get a note about it. Those are kind of fun. Those are great collaborative relationships to have. And as much as I joke and say, it's a benevolent dictatorship, it's still a collaborative art. And what I always tell actors is what I'm looking for is for them to bring everything they have to the table. And then I have this smorgasbord of options in front of me, and then I get to pick and choose what goes on the plate. And I think that's the best way to describe how the most positive working relationships work on the stage.
Yes. And the one thing you said that is so perfect is the fact that when you can work with people you've worked with before, or with a group, a theater group you've worked with before, and I did that at some of the colleges that I worked at, boy, that really makes a difference. Oh my God, it makes, One other factor, now that we're talking about directing, I just have to throw in, I've noticed it's very, very easy to direct a show that's going to go over beautifully and be a tremendous success. And you could almost die when you have one of those turkeys that you're doing and it's not going to be good and you keep trying. And it's so little work to do the successful ones and so much work to do the failures. It just is.
It's true. And
boy, can I remember.
When I had my theater in the LA area before moving, I now live in Southern Oregon, but we used to live in LA and we had our own theater there, and we were producing around the clock. We would produce 10 shows a year. So we were rehearsing on top of shows. One show would be running while another show would be rehearsing. And we would generally, our schedule was a show would close and 5 days later, a new show would open. And when you're producing that much theater, you have to come to terms that not every show is going to be better than the last show. And not every show is going to be your best show.
And you are in competition with yourself.
Correct.
You're in competition with what you've done beautifully, yes. Yeah, you're always, they expect every show to be that good or better. Yeah, which is kind of an unfair request.
One of the other favorite things I picked up along the way from my years at doing this is, and it's a Hamlet reference. I think you'll appreciate this. And friends of mine who are also directors, we sort of have this, slang term that we use. Like I might call a friend and say, "Hey, how's that show coming along that you're working on?" Or they know I'm working on the show. They'll say, "Hey, how are rehearsals going?" And we have a code that we use. We say pirates. I'm dealing with pirates. And it's a reference to Hamlet. And, the subtext is that you spend so much time working with the actors who are playing the smaller roles that it takes your time and energy away from the actor who really needs that time and energy to thrive in the leading roles. And Hamlet is one of those great examples where you could spend so much time with the damn pirates that your leading actor playing Hamlet is not getting the attention they deserve for this, magnanimous role. Yeah. And so, we have this slang term. We're like, the damn pirates. The pirates are killing me. P.S. I always cut the pirates from that production so that it'll have to deal with that problem. But it's, the metaphor still works. I always like to say pirates, fairies, and Ainsford Hills. Those are the three, because it's the fairies in A Midsummer Night Dream that sometimes could drive you crazy. It's the pirates in Hamlet, and it's the Ainsford Hills in Pygmalion, which is George Bernard Shaw, obviously. But, there's the thing about the Ainsford Hills is you can't cut them. They're necessary to the story. They have to be there.
No, you can't. No,
you can't cut those characters, but they're such small roles that it's hard to get really great actors willing to play those roles. So then you end up with these less than stellar actors who require so much of your time. that it takes away from the quality of the show, So I always said, I'm going to write a book someday, and that's going to be the title: Pirates, Fairies, and Ainsford Hills. And it's going to be about the challenges of directing major productions and dealing with small bit players.
And Ainsford Hill does have a little bit of a pivotal point in the show. I mean, Eliza does become influenced by him and stuff. So you can't let it completely go. But by the same token, as you say, it's so easy to get caught up with trying to make that one right. Yeah, you can do it over and over and over. Same with a scene that's not working. I remember a scene I was doing a section of Funny Girl, and a scene with 3 people, and I bet I did it. And let's have another rehearsal, and for just that one little dialogue in that scene. That just, the more you work on it, the worse it becomes.
Well, Ted, let me ask you. So, we've talked about the novel, and listeners, it is called The Shakespeare Conspiracy. It is a novel by Ted Bacino. His last name is spelled Bacino. You can find it wherever books are sold. And it is published through Author House. And there is a play version as well. But Ted, what are there other works that you have written that we could find if we're so inclined to want to see your other work? Or is this it? The Shakespeare Conspiracy was your tour de force, and that was your contribution?
Well, number one, I've spent my whole lifetime writing, and I'm 90 years old, and I still write. I still write a newsletter for banks and credit unions every month, which drives me crazy. I say to my children as they begin to retire from life, when does your father get to retire? So I still write. But as far as literary things, I've been concentrating for the past, about a year. I've written a play called it's called Buonarroti because it's about Michelangelo, and his last name is Buonarroti. And I'm finishing that, and I have planned. I've talked to the gentleman who produced Shakespeare Conspiracy off Broadway, and he says that he's working on a show right now, but he says he'll do it off Broadway next year. So send you a copy, and maybe you might get a chance to even see it produced.
That would be great. I like
the stories. Michelangelo is interesting. He was ultra religious, and in his entire lifetime, he only had one true love, and he was 58, and the boy was 18. Tommaso de Cavalieri. I like working with historical stuff because you don't have to invent, and he used him as the model for the statue of David that Michelangelo did. So, pledge a copy.
Well, and now is that going to be like? Would that be a full-fledged play with multiple characters and settings, or are we talking sort of like a monodrama?
No. It's a full play. Yeah.
Because I could see where Michelangelo could be a great subject for a monodrama as well.
Yes, he had. People don't realize how great he really was until you start looking at a list of all of his works and staggering. Yeah.
Yeah,
and also the competition that he had with Da Vinci and all of this. There's with all of them, there's a story there, a real story. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to share with us today and to talk about this fun novel. Again, folks, it's called The Shakespeare Conspiracy by Ted Bacino, Bacino. It is a delightful read and lots of fun. The connections, like we've mentioned, between Marlowe and Stratford Will and Thomas Walsingham and Thomas Kidd, who we didn't really talk about, but is also obviously included in there because, as Ted pointed out, Kit Marlowe and Thomas Kidd were roommates for a time period. It's a fun read. It really has this wonderful section in the back with all of the historical facts that you find in each chapter, which is also a great thing to read through after you've finished the book. I don't suggest reading each chapter and then going to the end notes. I suggest read the entire book, then read the end notes. You'll remember these factual moments then as you go through and you go, oh, wow, I thought that, or I wondered that. And that's a fun part of the experience of the book. As Ted says, it may be performing in an off-Broadway theater house sometime again soon. So we'll look forward to that. And hopefully, Ted, you'll keep us informed about where and when that happens, when it does happen. And again, I want to thank you for your time and thank you for sharing your work with us.
Stephen, thank you. I really enjoyed not only discussing it with you because you have so much background in it, but it's interesting to talk to another director to have that viewpoint. So, Stephen, thank you very, very much. I really enjoyed this.
Absolutely. Well, there he is, ladies and gentlemen, at a spry 90 years old, Ted Vicino, author of The Shakespeare Conspiracy. Before we close this one out, I would like to shout out to John Creider, our February Quiller of the Month. John is a 2-time Quiller of the Month. I believe this is his second win. And I happen to know, because he sent me an email and told me so, that he is choosing the cell phone case, the Don't Quill the Messenger cell phone case from our swag shop. If you haven't visited the swag shop and looked at some of the items that are there, you need to do that. You can access it from the homepage of our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. I'd also like to remind you that you too can get yourself into the running for Quiller of the Month by becoming a patron at the correct level at our Patreon page. You can access that page also right from the homepage of the website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. At the Patreon page, you can find out all of the patron details and levels. You can access additional social media content and learn about our growing library of bonus features. The latest 2 bonus episodes, parts 1 and 2, because it was quite a long and extensive demonstration of details, nearly 3 hours total between the 2 episodes of exploration into Edward de Vere's very mysterious death and the highly intriguing details about occurrences leading up to that fateful day and then during the several years afterward. Upon completing those episodes, I have to tell you, Quiller Nation, I am now convinced that he did not die on St. John the Baptist's Day in June of 1604, but went on to live like Jaques out in the forest of Arden, only it was the forest of Waltham in real life for Edward, and followed a semi-monastic life, just like his great, I'm not even sure how many greats are needed here, but just like Aubrey de Vere the First did during his end-of-life journey. And yes, you'll learn in those bonus features that there was a family historical precedent for an Earl of Oxford to retreat into religious life at the end of his life. And it was for very specific reasons, including legal reasons and inheritance reasons, that you'll learn much about if you listen to those 2 bonus features. So I encourage you to go to the Patreon page in order to access the library of bonus features. There's at least like 15 of them there now, I believe. And the next one is going to be another movie watch along. Annie and I will be watching Kenneth Branagh's Much Ado About Nothing and commenting along with the film. You'll be able to access that bonus. That's going to be the March bonus. You'll be able to access that bonus and watch the movie with us by accessing that feature. For more information, just go to the Patreon page and learn how. Real quick, be sure to visit monumentalshakespeare.com to get yourself registered for our event in Minneapolis in April. The block of extremely affordable hotel rooms is filling up fast, and there are fewer than 10 seats remaining for the Brittle Glory Marathon package of 3 Shakespeare history plays performed all in a row. You don't want to miss this event. You know, the reason why you won't find an event like this, not just our own event that we're putting together, but this Brittle Glory performance schedule that is so perfectly timed with our event, is that the Actors Equity Union, it's not easy for a theater, and only a theater of the type of reputation that the Guthrie has could possibly negotiate the contract with Actors Equity Union to have these actors do this marathon day. It's the same 25 actors going to perform all 3 plays all in one day. And so they're putting in probably a 15-hour day. And they had to negotiate quite a special contract, overtime pay, certain rules, regulations about the time between the plays to give the actors rest, the type of and length of the intermissions. All of that had to be negotiated to make sure that this could happen. And it's one of the reasons why you would be hard pressed to find a performance schedule like this anywhere in the world. Excuse me. So I want you to really think about getting there. Again, we have fewer than 10 of those special tickets available. Go to monumentalshakespeare.com. You don't want to miss this event. And just real quick, I want to say we are so grateful to our sponsors, Frederickson Law Firm, and of course, our Patreon patron, John Foss, who has been a guest on the program. Those folks have helped us make this event happen and help to keep it so affordable. Other Shakespeare authorship events cost as much as double to attend, with expensive room rates at high-end hotels and high registration fees. So come join us in Minneapolis. You won't be disappointed. That's all for now, fellow Quillers. Thank you again to our guest, Ted Bassino. It was indeed an intriguing conversation. Ted, God bless you, 90 years young. What a wonderful talk we had together. And until next time, say it with me out loud, won't you, fellow Quillers, wherever you happen to be. Say it so other people around you will hear you say it, and then ask you what you're talking about so that you have a reason to share the podcast with them. Are you ready? Keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.